Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the Mavuika pre-release video! Now, I have already posted a first impressions video, and since then, she has gotten some relatively major changes. That being said, there hasn't been any changes to her mechanics or descriptions, other than, like, minor wording changes. It's just the numbers that got changed a bit. So, let's get right into it. Starting with her base stats. So, base HP, 12,552, base attack, 359, base defense, 792. Now, as usual, the base attack in a vacuum doesn't really mean that much because, well, any damage stat is going to end up taking your attack and your motion value, your multipliers anyways. So if it has high attack but low multipliers, it doesn't matter. So in a vacuum, the base attack itself doesn't really mean too much. But it is interesting that this is the highest base attack in the game. Base HP and base defense. Her base HP is like pretty average. Her base defense is a bit on the high side. All in all, she's a character that is going to not really struggle with squishiness issues, but also not be Neuvillette. Crit damage ascension stat, which is much better than crit rate ascension stat on Natlan characters who can use the Obsidian Codex set that gives you 40% crit rate. Because if you have crit rate ascension, that's 24.2. Obsidian, that's 40, so you're at 64.2. And then if you also have a crit rate weapon on top of that, it's really easy to overcap, so it makes the crit rate weapons a lot harder to use. In any case, let's take a look at what she does. So, she has a 4-hit normal attack combo with pretty shitty multipliers. The charge attack has a relatively high multiplier, and it's not like most other charge attack users, or most other Claymore charge attack users, where it does like a cyclic thing, or a slashing thing, like Diluc or Noel. It's not like this. It's a lot closer to Kinich, where you do one attack. That being said, the multiplier is not really high enough to justify the animation time, so as we're gonna see when we get into the rest of the kit, none of this really matters. Her plunge multiplier is normal. It's not, she doesn't have that Diluc thing where he just has a really high plunge multiplier for some reason. However, you pretty much are never going to use this because when she's on field, you're generally going to use her skill, which changes her normal attacks. So, let's read through it. Calling upon her authority over conflict, Mavuika summons the all-fire armaments passed down through the line of human Archons, dealing Night Soul-aligned Pyro damage. After using this, Mavuika's Night Soul points are restored to max value and she enters the Night Soul's blessing state. The max value is 80, and as we're going to see, the amount of Night Soul points that she generates matters a lot for her kit. Not just the amount of Night Soul points that she generates, but also the amount of Night Soul points that the rest of the team generates. So keep that in mind, that she gets 80 Night Soul points from her skill. That matters a lot. All Fire Armaments has different forms when tapped or held. Tap. Divine Name Unleashed. The All-Fire Armaments manifest as a ring of searing radiance. The ring follows the current active character and attacks nearby opponents at intervals, dealing Night Soul-aligned Pyro damage. The AoE of the ring is reasonably big. Unless the enemies are like really far away from each other, it shouldn't really pose a problem in terms of hitting enemies in AoE. It hits every 2 seconds, dealing a little bit over 200 motion value. It'll hit a total of 6 times, plus the initial hit, so a total of 7 Pyro hits. So basically, the first version of her skill, if you tap it, gives you off-field Pyro application every 2 seconds for a duration of 12 seconds. Hold! Ancient Name Unbound. The all-fire armaments manifest as a Flame Strider. In this state, Mavuika can ride the Flame Strider at high speed, or activate its hidden backup propulsion mode to temporarily cross various terrain types and glide in midair. So this second part is just exploration stuff. Mavuika's normal, charge, and plunge attacks will also be converted to deal Night Soul-aligned Pyro damage, which cannot be overridden. When sprinting, she also deals Night Soul-aligned Pyro damage to opponents along her path. While in the Night Soul's Blessing state, tapping the skill can switch between the All-Fire Armaments form. The armaments will disappear once Mavuika's Night Soul's Blessing state ends. In other words, this skill hold transforms her normal attacks, charge attacks, and plunge attacks into different things with a bike. Now you'll see that the numbers for it are actually lower than the numbers for the base animations. However, that doesn't actually mean they're bad. And the reason for that is because of the Elemental Burst. Elemental Burst, Hour of Burning Skies. Let the people's inner voices reach the divine throne in the heavens, which is a very useful ability description, so thank you for that. Mavuika's Elemental Burst is not reliant on energy, but instead on Fighting Spirit. Now, what is Fighting Spirit? Mavuika can obtain Fighting Spirit via the following methods. When in combat, Night Soul points consumed by party members are converted to Fighting Spirit. And this is where what we said earlier about amount of Night Soul points on the skill comes into play. She's going to get 80 Night Soul points from her own skill, and she can gain additional Night Soul points from other Natlan characters on her team entering Night Soul state and consuming Night Soul points. Additionally, when nearby party members' normal attacks hit opponents, Mavuika gains 1.5 Fighting Spirit. This can trigger once every 0.1 seconds. The reality is that this doesn't really do anything. Technically, it means that on characters like Arlecchino, for example, you'll get an additional almost 30 Fighting Spirit if you were to use Arlecchino in a Mavuika team. If you were to use Clorinde, you'd get something like that as well. But any Natlan character is giving you like 80 plus Fighting Spirit. And so the amount of Fighting Spirit that you gain from this is very small compared to what you get from other Natlan characters. Mavuika's Fighting Spirit limit is 200, and when Mavuika has at least 50% Fighting Spirit, she can consume it all to unleash her Elemental Burst. In other words, you don't need to be full Fighting Spirit to use your ultimate. You can use it as long as you have at least half. However, the strength of the burst is going to increase based on the amount of Fighting Spirit that you have. So after using this, Mavuika gains 10 Night Soul points and enters the Night Soul's Blessing state. Riding her Flame Strider high in the air, she uses a powerful Sunfell Slice against opponents on the ground, dealing Night Soul aligned AoE pyro damage and entering the Crucible of Death and Life state. Crucible of Death and Life. During this state, Mavuika's various actions will no longer consume Night Soul points, and her interruption to resistance is increased. The interruption resistance multiplier is 0, which means she gets infinite resistance to interruption. It's the same interruption resistance multiplier as Raiden in her burst. So assuming they don't change it, it effectively means that she cannot get interrupted during her burst. Also, the damage dealt by Sunfell Slice, which is the burst initial cast, and Ancient Name Unbound, which is basically hold version that changes her normal attacks during her skill. Normal and charge attacks is increased based on the amount of Fighting Spirit she has when using the burst. So that's what I said earlier, that it gets stronger based on the amount of Fighting Spirit you use. Crucible of Death and Life will be cancelled when Mavuika leaves the field. In a team that is properly built around her, maxing out your Fighting Spirit is going to be very doable. Even in teams that aren't her optimal teams, you may not be able to max it out, but you'll get to at least 160 relatively easily, right? Because she herself has 80 plus 10 from the burst itself, and any Natlan character is getting you pretty much 80 just by being on the team. So, let's take a look at what the multipliers are gonna look like. N1 to N4 are all around 200, N5 is 260, and the charge attack is 370. She gets her hits out about as quickly when she's doing normal attacks versus when she's doing charge attacks. Which means that pretty clearly, assuming these are going at the same speed, I think anyone would be able to conclude, oh, that means her charge attacks are better than her normal attacks. And indeed, Mavuika's charge attacks are really good. The charge attacks are what have been nerfed the most. Looking at Town Level 10, the nerf she got since my first impressions video was, I mean, technically there was a nerf to the charge attack, or to the normal attacks, but the normal attacks weren't particularly good to begin with, so that's not what we really care about. What we really do care about is the nerf to the charge attacks, which went from around 500 motion value per charge attack hit to around 400, right? Which is a very sizable nerf. However, they didn't touch the burst initial hit multipliers. That part has stayed the same. Compared to my first impressions video, her damage during her uptime has gone down a little bit, but her front load is still just as good. Does that mean that she got a pretty big hit to her damage? Does that mean that she's bad? No, far from it. But we'll get into that a little more later. Before that, let's finish reading the rest of the kit. So Ascension 1 passive, when a nearby party member triggers a Night Soul Burst, which is a trivial condition, this is going to have 100% uptime in her teams. Mavuika's attack is increased by 30% for 10 seconds. So she has 30% attack from this passive. Ascension 4, after using her Elemental Burst, every point of Fighting Spirit present when it is used increases the damage that the current active party member deals by 0.2%. So at 200, that's 40%. This effect lasts 20 seconds, decaying over this duration until it reaches 0. This is pretty good. It's like Xilolen's damage bonus, but reversed, basically. We've already talked about the multipliers on the normal and charge attacks. Let's add the multipliers on the skill, right? So 217%. And the burst initial hit is 756.2 plus 2.7% times the amount of Fighting Spirit you have. And all of this is style level 9. Let's think about what exactly you can expect out of a rotation on her. So the first thing is the amount of attacks you get on each thing. During the Crucible of Death and Life, which it lasts for 7 seconds, if you input a charge attack, you'll be able to get 8 hits from the charge attacks before the burst runs out. So this is motion value, this is amount. We're not using normal attacks. You'll get 8 hits from the charge attack, 1 hit from the E cast, 6 hits from the E damage over time, and 1 hit from the Q cast. Which brings your total motion value, your total multipliers, to around 3,000 from charge attacks, almost another 3,000 from skill plus burst. What that means is that if you don't do charge attacks at all, her damage goes down a lot, obviously, but she still does a pretty large chunk of her damage, right? If you were to compare this to, you compare it to Arlecchino, and you look at the sort of damage that Arlecchino can output without spending field time, you'll notice, well, that's really low. Her burst multiplier's okay, but it's not great. The skill multiplier is kind of bad. Most of her damage is from her normal attacks. Mavuika, on the other hand, has a pretty good portion of her damage coming from her abilities that don't rely on her spending time on field. Which means Mavuika is going to be a character that can be played as an off-field damage dealer. Now, how good is that going to be? We'll get into that later. Before we talk about her ability as an off-field damage dealer, let's talk about her ability as an off-field elemental applicator. So like we said earlier, if you're using her as an off-fielder, you'll get a power application when you cast, and then an additional 6 power applications, 1 every 2 seconds. Now, what sort of characters can benefit from that? What sort of characters can use that as the off-field pyro unit for their teams? Right, if we look at characters that require, or at least benefit from having pyro units on their team, we have Chasca, where the pyro unit kit doesn't really matter too much. It's not about the application. So we'll talk about it more later, but her application doesn't really matter for Chasca. Kinich, where the application also isn't really what matters too much. It's more so about the utility and the damage. Mualani, first character where the speed of the application actually matters. How does Mavuika work for Mualani? Is she applying enough pyro? Yes. When it comes to Mualani teams, there's a few ways to go about building one, but for the purposes of a discussion around Mavuika, we can separate them in 2 different categories. You have Mualani teams where you need fast pyro and Mualani teams where you don't. The Mualani teams where you need fast pyro are the Mualani teams where you're playing her with a second hydro unit that also applies some hydro. So for example, if you're playing Mualani with Xilonen. Now, I think this is especially relevant in this abyss, where the second side requires a bow user to knock down the Aeon Blight Drake, and the first side requires good hydro application in order to break the Kukasaur's shield. And so in both of those situations, Mualani benefits a lot from having Xilonen on the team. All in all, Xilonen and Mualani teams is a very reasonable option. Other than Xilonen, you'll also have Candace if she's C6. Fast pyro won't be necessary if your Candace isn't C6, but if she is, it can be a problem. And the last hydro teammate that you often see with Mualani, where you need fast pyro, is Farina. A lot of people dismiss Mualani-Farina teams as kind of not great, which in terms of reliably vaping your Mualani stuff, yeah, that's fair. In terms of speedrunning, they're generally not the best teams, but Farina's off-field damage and buffs make it so that even when things go wrong in your Mualani team and you kind of f your vapes, you still get reasonable team DPS. And in my experience, they tend to be the Mualani teams that feel the best to play. In those sorts of teams, Mavuika won't be too great, because when you look at what Xiangling does, with Xiangling you can still get a decent amount of vapes. You can still vape somewhat reliably. With Mavuika's slower pyro application, that won't be the case. You pretty much won't vape any of your hydro stuff. Mavuika will vape, but that's not as good. Other than that, what else do we have? Clorinde and other electro carries that are played in Chevaleur's teams, where you want some form of off-field pyro to upkeep your pyro and electro resistance shred from Chevaleur's passive. In those teams, Mualani will function in terms of her pyro application without a problem. And again, we'll talk about each specific team a lot more once we get into the team section towards the end of the video. Right now, I just really want to talk about the sorts of teams where her application is going to enable her to become an alternative, whether an upgrade or a downgrade, to Xiangling. Navia wants some form of off-field application in her teams to make sure you can trigger Crystallize, but the speed of that application doesn't need to be fast. You just need to have enough. And as long as you do, then that's all that really matters. We'll talk more about Mavuika's strengths and Navia teams, but in terms of application, she definitely functions. When it comes to Wriothesley, you'll have mainly vape melt teams for Wriothesley and like pure melt teams. The vape melt teams are you use currently you use Wriothesley, Farina, Xiangling. The aura in those teams is a little up in the air, and you kind of end up vaping or melting on whichever character ends up getting it. If you replace Xiangling with Mavuika in that team, you won't get reactions on your Farina and Wriothesley anymore. It's pretty much all going to be Mavuika, which won't be necessarily the best, but it won't be bad either. When it comes to pure melt teams, looking at the off-field pyro application, is it enough to enable Wriothesley to melt, assuming that you don't have other elements being applied? It can be. Characters like Wriothesley that have inconsistent application, in the sense that your application doesn't happen to every X amount of seconds. Rather, you have one application, then little pause, and then 2 in a row, and then another one, and stuff like that, right? When that's the case, it makes it so that if you start having to dodge, if you start having to wait a little bit because you're waiting on an enemy to move or something like that, it changes your timings around. And it means that there will be situations where Mavuika's application will not be fast enough to reliably melt all of Wriothesley's stuff. However, it should be fast enough to melt most of it in the default case scenario. When it comes to characters like Neuvillette, so hydro carries that want Pyro to vape their stuff, outside of Mualani, when you look at those hydro carries, you'll notice that they don't have ICD that is particularly favorable to reaction stuff. Neuvillette can only vape a relatively small portion of his damage when you play him in vape teams. It's not a minuscule portion, but it's not a very big one either, which is why his vape teams don't tend to be that popular. Even if you vape every single vapeable hit, it's less than half of his motion value that's getting vaped. It's gonna end up being more than half of your damage because vaping multiplies the numbers. But the point is, he doesn't benefit from vape as much as a character like Hu Tao, who's vaping most of her damage because most of her damage is from her charge attack that doesn't have ICD. Because of that, vape Neuvillette isn't necessarily looking for a really fast pyro applicator. He can benefit from a really fast pyro applicator, but if you were to put a pyro unit in a Neuvillette team, they could bring value to the team even if it's not by enabling Neuvillette to vape a lot. As such, Mavuika should be fairly good in those Neuvillette teams, not as an off-field pyro applicator that can enable Neuvillette to vape, but as an off-field damage dealer that also gives you a damage buff through Cinder City if you're using that, or at least through her Ascension passive. Outside of that, Burgeon stuff, I guess we can talk about. What Burgeon is looking for is kind of weird. The default interactions that go into Burgeon requires Hydro, Dendro, and Pyro, and the reactions that can be triggered by that are obviously the Burgeon itself, but also Burning and Vape. Because of the way that the reactions work, because when you trigger Burning, it strengthens your Pyro aura, and it consumes your Dendro aura, while preventing you from triggering Bloom for a bit. When you're looking at a Burgeon team, if you have fast pyro application, it can prevent you from triggering a lot of blooms. That's one of the main reasons why in Burgeon teams with off-field pyro, Toma tends to see a lot of play. It's because Toma hits with pyro often, which is what's necessary to proc Burgeon, but he doesn't apply pyro often. He only applies pyro every third hit of his burst. That way, he won't trigger burning too often, which will allow you to trigger more blooms. Now, hypothetically, there could be future characters where the interactions work differently. Because if you're playing in a Burgeon team, a Hydro character who benefits a lot from being able to vape, then you would want a fast pyro applicator. You would want to be able to use your pyro application as a way to enable more vapes. Right now, though, we don't really have any teams that are focused around both Burgeon and vape damage. Technically, there's a few. There's the Wriothesley by Marie team, right? With Wriothesley, Baiju, Xiangling, Farina. There's weird burn vape stuff with Mualani, but you don't really trigger any Burgeon in those teams. And some people use Nahida or other Dendro units in vape Neuvillette or vape Farina teams. I'd say that compared to Xiangling, she has much slower Burgeon trigger rate and pyro application. So in Burgeon teams, Her main upside is that she's not burst reliant, right? You don't need to build a lot of ER on her, which allows you to build more EM. But I'm not convinced of its power. I can't really think of a Burgeon Mavuika team where it'll feel good to use Mavuika. Mavuika is going to be strong, as we'll talk about later. She's going to be strong enough that you can kind of put her in any team and it'll be fine, but we'll get to that later. Conclusion for this part is just, I don't see her application synergizing too well with Burgeon. And that's kind of it for the archetypes. Other melt teams with Ganyu, you won't be able to use Ganyu's burst, but a lot of people don't use Ganyu's burst to begin with because it can be a little cringe to deal with. It'll become a different alternative. The teams are going to play a bit differently, but it should be pretty good. The biggest issue when it comes to looking at her performance in teams where you're using her as an off-fielder is how good her burst is. And why is that an issue? Well, as you can see, her burst does about as much damage by itself as her whole off-field. And if you react it, because you only need to react it once, it's probably going to do more. Like, her burst initial hit is just a lot of damage. To the point where it kind of ends up warping her team performance and her team synergy, where even if she's not that synergistic in terms of application, she'll still be a good option just because her burst does that much damage. Does that mean the burst is perfect? No. It has an incredibly long animation compared to a lot of other 5-star bursts, but it justifies its animation length by having really high damage and giving you a damage percent buff. And now, let's talk about our constellations. C1, Mavuika's maximum Night Soul points are increased to 120, and she gains Fighting Spirit 25% more efficiently. Additionally, she gains 40% for 8 seconds after gaining Fighting Spirit. So, C1 gives her 40% attack, and it also gives her basically 50% more duration on her skill, which obviously also means more damage from the skill, as well as the ability to be played without Natlan supports. 120 Night Soul points with 25% more Fighting Spirit efficiency means 150 Fighting Spirit from her own skill, which is not 200, right? It doesn't max it out, but it gets close enough that she's not reliant on having a Natlan support anymore. It's something you can consider going for if you don't have Xilonen and you don't like Citlali, you don't want to get her. This is definitely something you can consider. All in all, it's still, at worst, it's still a 40% attack buff, which is okay. C2, one of the Night Soul's Blessing State, Mavuika's base attack is increased by 200, which is already, this is a pretty big deal. 200 base attack is pretty good. It effectively means that her total attack is increased by like 500, because you get a lot of attack percent in her teams. And she obtains the following effects. If you're on Ring of Searing Radiance, nearby opponent's defense decreased by 20%. Now, this doesn't have a duration, which means that it's only active so long as Ring of Searing Radiance is active. So basically, the defense shred only applies while off field. And then Flame Strider, Mavuika's normal charge and burst initial hit deal increased damage based on 60, 90, or 120% of her attack. The more important one is 90% increased damage or increased motion value on the charge attack. 120 on the burst. Well, it only happens once, so it's not that big of a deal. So it's mostly this one paired with the 200 base attack. This is a very solid C2. Not quite as strong as Raiden's C2, but not too far behind. And with a better C1, I'd say that the gap from C0 to C2 is pretty similar, if not better than Raiden from C0 to C2. C3, Hour of Burning Skies, that's the burst. Because she's not a character who scales exclusively on any one of her talents, her C3 and C5 aren't that great, but between the C3 and C5, C3 is better. C4 enhances the damage percent buff effect. Damage increase gained does not decay over time and is increased by 10%. So instead of 40% going down to 0 over 20 seconds, it's now 50% not decaying for 20 seconds. It's alright. It's not very good for her carry teams, but it's pretty good for her support teams. But why would you go for C4 if it's her support teams? What are you doing? C5, not great, but like fine. And then C6, the all-fire armaments from the skill receive all-around improvement. So for the off-field, when the ring's attack hits opponents, a Flame Strider will crash into the struck opponent, dealing 200% of attack as Night Soul aligned damage. So basically, whenever your ring hits, you deal more damage. Now, this does not apply Pyro, which means it can't vape or melt, but it also won't change your elemental application. So it's just a nice little bit of additional damage. This is kind of ass. And then Flame Strider. When Mavuika is riding the Flame Strider, she will also summon a Scorching Ring of Searing Radiance to follow her, which will decrease nearby opponent's defense by 20% and deal 500% of attack as nice aligned pyro damage once every 3 seconds. This is the good part. It's a good C6. Not the best C6, but it's a good C6. All in all, she's got above average constellations, I'd say. All in all, as usual, don't spend money on this shit game, but if you are going to go for something for her, between C1R0 and C0R1, I'd lean more towards C0R1 if you're also playing her with Xilonen and or Citlali. And between C2R0 and C1R1, I think it's C2R0 without a doubt. Now, we can do the usual pre-release stuff where we go through weapons, artifact stats, artifact sets, and teams. First things first, her signature, 1,000 Blazing Suns. 741 base attack, crit rate substat. Now, the crit rate substat is actually a pain in the ass. As I've mentioned earlier, she's an Atlan character. You want to use Codex on her. So this can make it a bit annoying not to overcap. However, it's only 11%, right? It's the highest possible base attack a 5-star weapon can have. So it's not a 30% crit rate weapon. It's only 11, so it won't be too bad. But you can overcap with it. Just keep that in mind. So, gain the Scorching Brilliance effect when using an elemental skill or burst. Crit damage increased by 20% and attack increased by 28%. While it's active, its duration is increased by 2 seconds after a normal or charge attack increase or deals elemental damage for up to 12 seconds total. Additionally, when equipping characters in the Night Soul's Blessing state, the effects are increased by 75%, and duration will not count down when the equipping character is off field. Part that matters here is this is effectively 20% crit damage, 28% attack stat stick. That becomes 35% crit damage, 49% attack on Natlan characters that can enter Night Soul. That's a lot of stats. It's a relatively average signature. Looking at recent signature releases, it's pretty much in line with what we've seen recently. It is about somewhere between 20 and 25% better than your free-to-play options, and about 10% better than the 5-star stat sticks. Wolf's Gravestone is ass. You are playing Mavuika with Bennett. If you're not doing that, you're an idiot and a loser. I'm exaggerating, of course. There are going to be non-Bennett Mavuika teams, but her best teams are going to use Bennett. And if you are using Bennett, you're getting Pyro Resonance, you have Bennett buff, Mavuika gets attack percent from her Ascension 1, her best teams have TTDS, you're getting a lot of attack. Which means that the attack percent you get from weapons like Wolf's Gravestone and the Unforged, it tends to be pretty redundant. It doesn't multiply the attack that she gets from all her other sources. You'd much prefer weapons that give you EM or crit. Because of that, Wolf's Gravestone tends to be about as good as her free-to-play options on teams where you use Bennett. Tends to be a little bit worse in the cases where you get all the reactions you can, and a little bit better in the cases where you only get 2 belts on the charge attacks. And that's the same for the Unforged. So basically, they're a fine 4-star stat stick, even if they're a 5-star. Redhorn. Redhorn has a passive that gives you more damage on your charge attacks, but Mavuika's multipliers are so wildly high already that this passive is almost meaningless. That being said, it's still a crit damage stat stick, which is gonna be all right. It is going to tend to be better than the 4-star. It's gonna be a solid 5-star stat stick. Not the best of the 5-star stat sticks outside of her signature, but pretty solid. Bacon is where things get complicated. Bacon gives you 33.1% crit rate. That's a lot of crit rate. Obsidian Codex is 40%. This is 33.1, and you start at 5. So that means you're starting at 78.1% crit rate. That means you can still have room for 20% crit. However, when you're looking for good artifacts, the more different substat rolls are good, the easier it is to get a good artifact. When you start reaching the sort of builds where you have a lot of substats, a character having a certain feature that makes one of those substats completely worthless makes it a lot harder to get a good build. Now, when you're using Bacon on Mavuika, it doesn't make crit rate worthless, but it does mean that you can't get crit rate on all of your artifacts anymore. Unless you get crit rate on all of your artifacts, but don't roll into it a single time, pretty much. Now, if you can still get yourself a good build, Bacon is going to tend to be her best non-signature 5-star weapon. However, 33.1% crit rate is a lot, so it's going to tend to be the hardest weapon to not waste stats on. The main thing is when you're looking at a build with bacon or crit rate weapons in general on Mavuika, your circlet, you're gonna want crit damage, but you don't want to roll into crit rate. So you care more about rolling into attack percent and EM than rolling into crit rate on your circlet. Verdict is also a solid 5-star stat stick. It can have the same issue because it's also a crit rate weapon, but at 22.1, it means that you're starting at 67.1%, which means you can still get over 30% crit rate from your substats. That tends to be a lot less restrictive than overcapping after 20% from substats. Fang of the Mountain King, same stat line as her signature. Can technically be an issue, but generally won't be. It's a good 5-star stat stick. It'll generally be a little bit worse than the other ones, but it's still a fine stat stick. Now, Serpent Spine, much like Bacon, there's a lot of nuance to it. If you manage to get a good, like if your best Serpent Spine build is the same quality as your best build on another weapon, Serpent Spine is going to be her best 4-star weapon, and it can even be her second best weapon after her signature at R5. However, on top of the annoying stuff build-wise, because it's a crit rate weapon at 27.6% crit rate, in order to use a Serpent Spine at its best, you also need to wait for 30 seconds at the start of each chamber, which is honestly just annoying and boring. And so I like looking at Serpent Spine with 3 stacks instead of 5 average, because that tends to be where it hovers in practice. And in those situations, it doesn't really tend to pull ahead of the 5-star weapons, the non-signature 5-star weapons. And at low refine, it's also not really pulling ahead of the other 4-star options. Next is Mailed Flower. Now, if you didn't get Mailed Flower because you didn't do that event, honestly, it sucks to be you, bozo. You're a loser and cringe, actually. Mailed Flower is really good for her. Assuming that you are playing her in a team where she's being played as a carry and you're reacting her stuff, Mailed Flower is her default free-to-play option. Again, assuming you're reacting your reactable stuff, Mailed Flower is going to be about as good as Wolf's Gravestone. However, you won't necessarily be able to play her in reaction teams. Now, you should. Her reaction teams are much better than her non-reaction teams, but some people don't want to. Some people want to play specific other characters. Some people want to play her in a Chivalrous team. They're like, sure, whatever. If that's the case for you, Mailed Flower will not be as good. And her best free-to-play option is going to instead be something like Tidal Shadow. Now, Rainslasher in vape teams is going to be a good alternative for people who didn't get Mailed Flower in the event, but it's not really even better than Mailed Flower in most situations. So if you have Mailed Flower, I'd focus on that. But Rainslasher can still work. Now, like I said earlier when I talked about Wolf's Gravestone, she tends to have an issue with attack percent stat sticks, and then on top of that, there's not that much of her damage coming from her elemental skill in teams where you're using her as the main carry, and so Earthshaker will not be too great. It can be fine in teams where you're using her as an off-fielder, but I would rarely consider this over Tidal Shadow. Talking Stick is a fine 4-star option that's going to tend to be competitive in reaction teams with Mailed Flower, but not even much better, but it will pull ahead a little bit of Tidal Shadow in non-reaction teams. And then finally, Blackliff. If you're averaging out Blackliff stacks to like 1 or 1.5, Blackliff is a pretty solid option overall, because obviously a crit stat stick is better than an attack stat stick. The main issue is that Mavuika does enough damage that enemies won't survive past the first rotation, and a very large portion of her damage is concentrated at the start of the rotation, which means that averaging, or that looking at 1 average stack or 1.5 average stack on Blackliff is actually, in my opinion, a bit overly optimistic. I don't think that's particularly reasonable. So because of that, I'm not too positive on Blackliff, but if you don't have Mailed Flower, you don't have Tidal Shadow in non-reaction teams, and you have a Blackliff available, then yeah, you can use it. It'll be fine. But it's not really what I gravitate toward. Artifact sets. Use Codex. Now you might be thinking, so Jeff, you buffoon. Obsidian Codex only lasts for 6 seconds when consuming Night Soul points. Mavuika's burst says Mavuika's various actions will no longer consume Night Soul points during her burst. Why would I use Codex when it doesn't even have 100% uptime? Well, Codex is just that good. Even without 100% uptime, it's better than the alternatives because so much of her damage is front-loaded. What are the other alternatives? Obviously, you have Maréchaussée, good in Farina teams. It is worse than Codex, however, it's not that much worse. Some people might be thinking, well, she's a character that doesn't care about energy, so surely Shimenawa's is going to be good with her, right? About that. If the character has 15 or more energy, guess which character cannot have more than 0 energy? Oh yeah, wait, right. Oops. Yeah, Shimenawa's doesn't work on her. Obviously, if you're playing her in a burning team for some reason, you could use Unfinished Reverie, but don't play her in a burning team. Other than that, you could consider putting her on Vermilion, on Gilded, and then on a bunch of 2-piece stuff. But really, all of those end up being pretty similar to one another, where they're just, you can do it if you want, but it won't be nearly as good as her actual good sets. So, 2-piece, or 4-piece, whatever. Okay. That's for when you're using her as a carry. Now, when you're using her as a support, it opens up a few new things. The first one is Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City, and the reality is that Cinder City is not actually good on her. The main reason for that is because there is very little reason to play Mavuika in teams where there's no other Natlan character. And she does so much damage that you often rather have the other Natlan character on Cinder City instead of her. Now that being said, you can still put her on Cinder City in teams where, for example, you're using her with Kinich. But then with Kinich specifically, there's the issue of applying Pyro on a burning enemy not counting as a reaction, which means that you can only proc it once and then you can't ever proc it again. You can look at Mualani teams, but the best Mualani teams will use Xilonen, and you'd want Xilonen on Cinder City. Although you could also do Mavuika on Cinder City, Xilonen on Petra. And all in all, Cinder City, often a fine option, but rarely better than Codex. So what is her best support set as a support? Well, it's Codex. Most of the time it's Codex. Her burst initial hit does so much damage that having Codex for that is kind of just enough. Other than that, you can also use her on Golden Troop, but it's like not great because a good portion of her damage is coming from her burst, and Golden Troop doesn't affect that portion of her damage. Whereas Codex actually does affect a decent portion of her skill damage and all of her burst damage. Artifact stats! In a good amount of situations, in her best teams, her optimal artifact distribution for main stats is not attack pyro crit. It's actually going to be EM pyro crit. She has so many sources of attack percent through her own kit and the supports she synergizes with, but very little, if any, sources of external EM buffs. Her reliance on Natlan units to generate fighting spirit is a pretty big obstacle to her potential synergy with characters like Sucrose, who are the usual reaction-focused EM buffers. And because of that, there are a lot of situations where your optimal sense is going to be EM. Now, if you're using an EM weapon like Mailed Flower, EM and attack sense tend to be very, very similar. But if you're not using an EM weapon, EM is actually often going to be her best stat for the sense. That being said, even when it is, it's not that far ahead of attack, so attack pyro crit is still going to be good. And more importantly, it'll work even when you f up your reactions or even when you play her in non-reaction teams. So if you want a more generic build, attack pyro crit will be completely fine for you. And finally, teams. Unfortunately, Mavuika's best team includes another unit that is getting released in the same patch, which means if we want to talk about Mavuika's best team, we need to very quickly give a rundown on Citlali's kit. Citlali is a cryo, catalyst, EM scaling shielder. She has not particularly good, but not completely negligible either damage output if she triggers melt on her burst. And she has fairly slow, but not insignificant, cryo application from off-field. The fact that she's a catalyst enables her to use TTDS, and the speed of her cryo application is enough to relatively reliably melt the first 2 reactable hits of Mavuika's charge attacks, and in very specific setups that are hard to replicate, potentially melt all 4 of the reactable hits of her spin during her burst. Citlali is going to tend to be part of Mavuika's best team. And for context, the way that her spins work out is you have time to do your initial hit, and then you have CA1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then after that, you have the final hit. This can react, this can react, this can react, this can react, and this can react. And then I guess this can react as well, but this one matters a lot less because some of your buffs may have run out, and the burst buff will also have run out for this one. So when I talk about the 4 reactable hits, I'm talking about hits 1, 4, 5, and 8 of her charge attack. Because there's a decent amount of time between the burst initial hit and the first hit of charge attack, even with slow cryo application, you can react those two very reliably. And because there's 2 non-reacted hits after the first one, reapplying cryo even with a relatively slow cryo applicator will almost always happen. So these 3 hits are very easy to react. However, getting the reaction on the 5th hit means that you need to apply cryo specifically between the 4th and the 5th hit, which is only going to happen if you set it up properly, and it seems to be very difficult to set it up properly. So when I look at melt teams for Mavuika, I generally tend to separate them between the realistic 3 out of 5 reacts, or 2 out of 4 looking at just the charge attack hits, right? Versus the technically possible but most likely unreliable 4 out of 4 reacted hits. When I say that Citlali is looking to be Mavuika's best partner, I'm talking about a 2 out of 4 react. Even with reacting only 2 out of 4, it is looking like Citlali is going to be part of Mavuika's best team. However, the difference between Citlali and your other alternatives is not actually that high. It's a fairly small difference. That being said, if you do end up getting a 4 out of 4 react, the difference between Citlali and others will be sizable. But I really don't think it's going to be reliable enough to assume that as the default way that the team is going to get played. Now that we have Citlali out of the way, what does a usual Mavuika team look like? You really want Bennett because Bennett's really good, and then you really want Natlan characters that have some form of synergy with her. When looking at Mavuika carry teams, Citlali will be good, Xilonen will be good, and then Auron will only be good in Chivalrous teams. We'll talk about Chivalrous teams separately, which means that your main 2 fighting spirit generators that you're gonna see are Xilonen and Citlali. Now, what if you didn't get Xilonen and you don't have enough primos to get both Mavuika and Citlali? You're going to see a massive difference between her performance and what you'll see on other people's accounts who have either Xilonen or Citlali. The reality is that it is going to be noticeable. That doesn't mean she's going to be unplayable. Mavuika, much like every other character in the game, spawns in Abyss with her burst fully up, right? Whereas for other characters, it means that they start with full energy. For Mavuika, it means that she starts with full fighting spirit. On top of that, she is definitely strong enough to be able to rotate a good amount of the content. Because of that, as long as you're willing to separate your clears instead of doing a continuous clear, like tackling chamber 1, then resetting, doing chamber 1, but then at the end stacking your fighting spirit back up by using Mavuika's skill and waiting, and then starting chamber 2 with 200 again, and then repeating the same thing for chamber 3. As long as you're willing to do that, Mavuika will have very strong teams with no other Natlan characters. However, doing that is incredibly unpleasant, and I would not recommend it. It's just something that you can do if you really want to make Mavuika work, but you don't have other Natlan characters. I'd say that if you really, really insist on playing Mavuika and you don't have the other Natlan characters, you're probably better off just using Kachina and taking the massive L. Now, because Citlali is coming out on the same patch, I think there's a good amount of people that are only going to get one of Mavuika or Citlali, which means that for most, the default core for Mavuika is going to be Mavuika, Bennett, Xilonen. Or rather, Bennett, Mavuika, Xilonen. The BMX core. Once you have your BMX core, what is the last slot going to be? You have a few options. Option number 1, Copium, I don't have Citlali, but I want to play Melt anyways. And your last slot is just a cryo unit. Most likely, you're going to get at most 2 reactions. But honestly, it's still going to be fine. Right, if you're using Rosaria, or Kea, hell, even Diona maybe. Although with Diona, you might only get 1 Melt. So BMX plus Citlali, best team. BMX plus Cryo, other than Citlali, solid. BMX plus Hydro. What Hydro characters work well with her? Well, her normal attacks aren't particularly good. Her charge attacks are amazing. That means she's not going to be too good with Xingqiu or Yelan. Who does that leave you? It leaves you with Farina. BMX plus Farina is likely going to be the best non-Citlali team. And from what I've looked at, I'm expecting this to be very similar to the BMX plus Citlali team when you're comparing 4 React Farina, because obviously it's really easy to get 4 reacts when you're vaping instead of melting, 2 react Citlali. Now, because with Citlali, your damage is more front-loaded and more focused on Mavuika herself, it means it scales better with investment. In practice, most people will see better performance on the BMX Citlali team than the BMX Farina team. But if you don't have Citlali and you do have Farina, you'll still be able to get most of the value out of Mavuika. Now, if you don't have Xilonen, you can do, obviously, if you're gonna end up getting Citlali, BM Citlali. Your last slot, you have a few options. You can use another Natlan characters because Mavuika plus Citlali is not enough to completely max out your fighting spirit. So you can use something like Kachina here. But honestly, even if you don't max it out with Mavuika plus Citlali, you're getting somewhere between 160 and 190 without too much of a problem. And so you're generally going to be better off using a different character that does something else. Sucrose is going to be a great option here. Kazuha as well, but obviously Sucrose's shorter animations are going to matter a lot more in teams like this where you have to cast multiple abilities after Bennett burst. You don't want to eat into your Bennett uptime too much, so shorter cast time characters like Sucrose will tend to perform a little bit better. But if you care about the grouping, Kazuha can still be very good, right? I'll just use Anemo here. I'm not going to separate the two, but it'll also be good. Other than that, you can do double Cryo, right? You benefit from Cryo Resonance, but then you get the same potential issue as you do with crit rate weapons, especially if the other Cryo you use ends up being Rosaria, which gives 15% crit rate herself. Now, I don't know exactly how the application lines up if you use Diona. Obviously, the EM buff you get from Diona will be very nice. If you can reliably get 4 applications with Diona, it'll be a good team. If not, it'll be still fine. Otherwise, you can use Rosaria, you can probably use Kea, you can probably use Ganyu. You probably have, honestly, a bunch of options here. This will also be quite good. Looking at her carry teams, the best ones are gonna be between BMX Citlali, BMX Farina, BM Citlali and Anemo, and BM Citlali Cryo. Like, these are gonna be the 4 best general Mavuika teams. Now, what if you hate Bennett? What are your options? You can do Farina, Citlali, Xilonen. The issue with something like this is that against bosses that can't be frozen, having both Hydro and Cryo off-fielders to enable your reactions on your Pyro characters, it means that anytime you trigger freeze on the boss, you wipe your aura. And if you apply Pyro right after that, you just lose your reaction, which is not ideal. Which is why I don't tend to like these teams too much. However, against any freezable enemies, instead of freeze wiping your aura, it generates a frozen aura, which can act as a cryo aura to let your Pyro character trigger melt. Oh wait, yeah, actually, maybe is Mavuika's stuff blunt? Shit, it is blunt. Yeah, I don't like this at all. The way that the aura is gonna work in a situation like this one, your Hydro aura will effectively only allow you to react either your Cryo or your Pyro hits. Which means that if you hit with Cryo and then Pyro on an enemy that had a Hydro aura, you won't get a reaction on your Pyro hit. That'll be a pain in the ass. However, that doesn't mean that non-Bennett teams have no options. You can play Xilonen, Citlali, and a second Cryo unit. You can play Anemo. I wouldn't recommend those particularly over the Bennett ones, but if you don't want to use Bennett, they will probably be your best options. One thing you may notice is that we've only mentioned one team that doesn't use Citlali. Or I guess technically 2 teams. Does that mean she's bad if you don't have Citlali? No. Her numbers are kind of crazy, and even her bad teams are going to be pretty good. In terms of output, you can expect more out of Mavuika than honestly any carry before her at C0 or 0. And then on top of that, she has a fairly strong signature and pretty good constellations. So at equal, like, whaling levels, you can expect very good results out of her compared to pretty much anyone. Will she be better? Not necessarily. Her animations are really, really long. Her burst animation is really long. And that means that when you're looking at like really high investment speedrun stuff, she won't necessarily be faster than the characters that have really quick setups and really high damage. But looking at the like total damage that she does, as of now, Mavuika is looking like a character that is definitely strong enough to make it so that if you don't have her good teams and you like her, you'll still be able to pull for her without her feeling like complete garbage to play. You'll still be able to clear your stuff without too much of an issue because she's strong enough for that. And if you don't care too much about characters and you care more about what they provide as units, she is going to be one of the better carries to go for. That is only the case if you have the good Natlan characters that work well with her though. In any case, I need to explain why so far I've only mentioned reaction teams. So if you look at a character like Arlecchino, who is probably the best example of a Pyro character that is good in reaction teams, but not reliant on those reactions to be good. Looking at her motion value before it's getting affected by reaction modifiers, about a third of her damage is reactable. About 1 in every 3 attacks can be reacted. That's more or less the like default damage distribution between reactable and non-reactable damage for a character to be able to gain about as much from being played in reaction teams as they can from being played in non-reaction teams with other characters that have better synergy outside of those reactions. Mavuika, on the other hand, it's closer to half. But then on top of that, there's also the fact that, seeing as her skill doesn't snapshot, a lot of this damage, which is, I mean, I guess technically it's reactable, but it's not going to be reacted in those reaction teams where you're playing her as a carry. Well, I guess it can be, but whatever. In like Citlali teams where the E off-field hits won't be reacted, the distribution of reactable stuff looks like this. But a good portion of this non-reactable damage is also not getting your Bennett buff, and maybe not even your Shred. So it's actually more than half of your damage that's reactable. And then if you're playing her in a team where you have much better application of your other elements, so a Farina team, for example, you can vape a good portion of your skill hits, which makes your reactable portion of her damage closer to 2/3 of her damage. Because of that, it means that she's a lot more reliant on being played in reaction teams to get the optimal output she can get. Or, in other words, she loses more damage from being played in teams where those reactions aren't happening. That's the main reason why the Chevaleur's Mavuika teams aren't going to be quite as good. Now, does that mean they're bad? No. They're actually still going to be fairly strong. However, Chevaleur's teams tend to rely on Constellations on the 4 stars a decent amount. And Mavuika Chevaleur's is really nothing special if you don't have high Constellation Chevaleur's and Oberon. If you have both of them, the team is like 30% better. In any case, Chevaleur's teams, from fine to good, depending on your Constellations on your 4 stars. Then Mono Pyro, okay. Not gonna be as good as the reaction teams, but it'll be better than a Chevaleur's team with all your stuff C0. So now, we can talk about those teams where you're using her as a support. Looking at Mavuika's skill versus Changeling's burst, if that's all you look at, Mavuika's a bad off-fielder. However, Mavuika's burst is so f***ing good. There are a lot of teams where you're currently playing Changeling that could actually become better, or at least like have a new alternative that's a side grade with Mavuika's release, just because of how strong her burst is. So let's go through a few of them and talk about the pros and the cons. First, Kinich. As of now, there are no Dendro or Pyro characters in Natlan outside of Kinich, which means that if you're playing a carry Kinich team, you don't have a Dendro or Pyro character that can wear Cinder City. Mavuika will change that. However, Mavuika's long animations start mattering a lot in Kinich teams. Obviously, in those Kinich teams, it's going to be much harder to end up triggering a reaction on Mavuika's burst, which makes it harder to justify spending a lot of your uptime, right? Because you want to use it after your Bennett buff, but then it's not getting reacted, and the damage gained from using Mavuika's burst becomes much smaller. Kinich already struggles with Bennett uptime, and Bennett buff often tends to run out towards the end of his animation of Kinich's uptime. Because of that, while Mavuika will be an upgrade to Kinich's teams, there is a lot of anti-synergy that prevents her from being a sizable one. On top of that, Pyro MC is also going to be a reasonable option for Kinich teams, which makes it very difficult for me to recommend pulling for Mavuika if the goal that you're trying to achieve is improving your Kinich team. It's going to be a much smaller increase than getting a Kinich Constellation or weapon. And if what you're looking for is a new team, Pyro MC will give you that. That being said, I do still think you can play Mavuika in Kinich teams with Farina in solo Dendro Kinich, and I do think it'll be alright in those teams because Farina allows you to vape Mavuika's burst, but it's still not going to be the best. When you're playing Burgeon teams instead of burning teams with Kinich, you tend to trigger his Ascension passive a bit less. And triggering his Ascension passive less, right? This passive that gives him 7 Night Soul points when enemies get affected by burning or Burgeon. Triggering this less means you can do less total skills. Now, when things line up well, it won't be too big of a deal. But when things don't line up well, not only do you get less damage from Kinich, but you spend less Night Soul because you generated less Night Soul, which means Mauika's burst is also doing less damage. Now, it'll still be good, but it can be a bit more of an issue because Mauika's skill has much slower pyro application, which means that she's going to trigger Burgeon much less reliably than Xilonen does in the Bennett, Xilonen, Farina, Kinich team. All of that being said, Mavuika will still be an upgrade to Kinich teams, just not a particularly major one. And like I mentioned earlier, Cinder City doesn't actually work if you apply Pyro to a burning enemy. If you apply Pyro to an enemy that only has a Dendro aura, it will trigger Cinder City. However, once the enemy is burning, unless you apply like Hydro, Cryo, or Electro, right, the elements that react with Pyro to enemies, the Pyro aura will effectively never disappear, which means you can only trigger Cinder City once in your whole fight. And so you can struggle with second rotation uptime, and your damage can go down on the second rotation in a way that can make the team a lot worse. In any case, for Kinich, it'll be a minor upgrade. Next, Mualani. The main thing that Mualani is good at right now is speedruns. Mavuika won't be a particularly sizable upgrade to Mualani's speedrun teams. The reason for that is because Mualani's speedruns are so fast already that Mavuika's burst animation is gonna double the clear time. That being said, Mualani's biggest problem is that her quality of life f***ing sucks. Mualani feels bad to play in a lot of situations. One of the biggest reasons for that is because her best teams tend to use Xiangling as a solo Pyro unit, and Xiangling ER requirements are a massive pain in the ass. Mavuika won't have that issue. In other words, when it comes to speedrunning, I don't see Mavuika being a particularly sizable upgrade. It'll be an upgrade at certain levels of investment where your clears aren't already like 6 seconds long. Like, I'm not saying it won't be an upgrade to speedrunning Mualani at all, but it won't be an upgrade in every speedrunning Mualani team. But more importantly, it'll be an upgrade to like when you're not at speedrun level investment, or you don't want to reset for good grouping RNG, whatever. But just general gameplay Mualani, I expect Mavuika to feel much better to play than Xiangling for those Mualani teams. And so the biggest upgrade that Mualani teams are going to get from Mavuika is massive quality of life. Chasca? Xiangling is currently part of one of Chasca's best teams. You don't get full value out of Chasca's passive when you're doing double Pyro, but it doesn't matter because Xiangling's good enough to be there anyways. Does Mavuika work in that slot? Yeah, she works pretty damn well. And she should be an upgrade to Xiangling in the slot. Next up, Navia. So currently, Navia teams tend to be split between double Pyro, Bennett Farina, and double Hydro. Technically, there's also double Pyro with Farina, with solo Geo Navia. That is also good, but it tends to be a bit less popular because people like seeing big numbers on Navia herself, and not having Geo Resonance makes that worse. With Mavuika's release, she will be a viable alternative in the double Pyro, but she will also enable Mavuika Farina as an additional alternative. The main thing I'm a little unsure about is how the teams are going to actually end up playing out. In my eyes, Mavuika does so much damage that I don't know if you actually want to just use her burst and then swap out. I feel like there's a solid chance, like when you swap to Navia, do tap E into hold E, and then actually spend time on Mavuika and spin, which is effectively a double carry team. And honestly, I expect it to be pretty solid. It's pretty much off-field Navia. Either way, it'll be good, and it'll give you more options for your Navia teams. Next up, support in Chevaleur's teams. I'm not as big of a fan of this one, though I don't think it's necessarily going to be bad. I think people are still sleeping on EM Xiangling in Chevaleur's teams when you're looking at electro carries, but it will be good. Her cooldown being 18 seconds, but that's 2 seconds shorter than Xiangling. This will allow you to do shorter rotations for electro carries that want that, like Clorinde, for example, who definitely does like the idea of getting slightly shorter rotations. The downside is that it kind of forces you to use Auron. Like, having to use Auron over actually having freedom to choose who you want to use is going to be more restrictive. I think this is the sort of stuff that is more likely to get better in the future once we get actual Natlan, Electro, or Pyro carries that can use Mavuika as a unit in those teams. What else? Wriothesley teams? It'll be okay. It's likely to be an upgrade over Xiangling in a few of them. And then the question becomes, does the team just become better if you put Wriothesley on TTDS and ignore everything other than the melt on the initial hit of Mavuika and just spin on her? And honestly, it might be, which is the biggest problem. It's not that it's going to be bad, it's just that such a waste of Mavuika's potential. Neuvillette teams? Like I talked about earlier, for Neuvillette teams, Mavuika's slower Pyro app means that she won't be able to overtake Neuvillette's app. However, because Neuvillette only vapes a small-ish portion of his damage, that's not really a big deal. It's something you're kind of okay with. And so Mavuika is a damage bonus character, like a damage percent buff character that has a bit of personal damage. And as such, she's a fine option in Neuvillette teams. When I say she's a fine option in Neuvillette teams, I'm not saying that the Neuvillette teams using her will only perform fine, because there's no such thing as a Neuvillette team that only performs fine. But I hope you get what I'm saying here. I wouldn't try to force Neuvillette vape teams, right? I would generally stick to Neuvillette Farina teams that where you just get vapes on a little bit of Mavuika's damage as a nice little bonus to her being there. I guess Monopyro as a support. I talked about Monopyro as a carry, but you play Xiangling and Monopyro as a support, so we can talk about Mavuika and Monopyro as a support. And the biggest issue with this is I don't think there's a single Monopyro team that uses Mavuika as a support that's better than staying on Mavuika and using her turret attack. So I'm not convinced about this one. But it's kind of like the Wriothesley stuff. Just because you're not capitalizing on all of her strengths doesn't mean that the team will struggle to clear stuff. It'll still be good. Now, Burgeon. I haven't talked about Burgeon yet. Like, pure Burgeon stuff with, like, double Hydro Nahi Dust or something like that. Or double Hydro on-field Baiju. It'll be okay. She's not going to be a better trigger than, like, Toma. But realistically, as long as you vape her burst, if you just ignore the Burgeon damage, it'll probably do more damage. Just because she's just that good. Like, it's not really a Burgeon team. Ganyu? I think that the effect on Ganyu teams will be very similar to the effect on Mualani teams, where Xiangling does not feel good to play in Ganyu teams because of her ER requirements, and Mualani's going to make the teams feel a lot better to play. However, Ganyu charge attacks are actually a little bit faster than every 2 seconds, so I'm not entirely sure if things can end up lining up well enough. I think in practice, as long as you are careful that, like, if the timing doesn't line up, you just hold off for less than half a second before you shoot. It shouldn't be too much of a problem. I think it'll be good, but it'll also be a big quality of life buff. I guess we can talk about Xiaoyun.
No.
Xiaoyun with her is like Xiaoyun with Harlequino. Actually, it's worse than Xiaoyun with Harlequino. Because at least Xiaoyun with Harlequino, like, if you do less normal attacks, you spend less time doing normal attacks, it means that a larger portion of your normal attacks will be dealt with a high bond of life. Like, if you only do 10 normal attacks instead of 18, the 8 normal attacks you're losing out on are the 8 normal attacks you would do with 50 or less bond of life remaining, or like 60 or less bond of life remaining, which do less damage than the ones you already did. With Mavuika, you don't even have a downside to attacking more, so it's just even stupider. Don't do that to yourself. I guess Raiden. Do you understand how Raiden works? Energy cost? Child. It won't be ideal. It's not really the sort of stuff you're looking for. It'll function, I guess, but it probably won't be better than Xiangling. Hu Tao. Funa Rational has seen a lot less play lately because Hu Tao has been given more options. But honestly, it's gonna be alright. It should be an upgrade to Xiangling in the Funa Rational. Will it be Hu Tao's best team? I don't know, but it'll be a good team. And the idea here is, like, you would only burst every other rotation on Mavuika, but you still get, like, fine damage from the skill and the Cinder City buff. Yeah, I guess we can also include Kachina for the, like, carry stuff that I didn't include earlier. BM plus Kachina plus, I don't know, I think that pretty much does it for the teams. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list of every possible Mavuika team, but this is a list of the teams where I expect there to be a decent amount of people who want to consider playing Mavuika in those teams. All in all, Mavuika's a strong unit. Although, I guess, okay, I need to put an asterisk on this one. People often say that, like, when I say a unit is okay, it means they're really good. When I say a unit is good, it means they're broken. And when I say a unit is broken, it means they're Neuvillette. I want to, like, properly give context for this one. Compared to other carries, I think Mavuika is looking like she's not going to be better than Neuvillette, but she is arguably going to be better than every other carry. Although that status of being better is reliant on you actually having the good Natlan teammates for her. If you don't, then she isn't. It's just nice that on top of that, she also has a good amount of teams where she's a good support, even though calling her a support when she's gonna do half the team's DPS just with her burst is maybe a bit dismissive, but whatever. But yeah, like, she compared to other carries is definitely among the best, but she's not quite on the same level as Neuvillette, where I would consider Neuvillette to be strong enough of a carry to be considered even before the good supports. I don't think that's the case for Mavuika. I think good supports on your account are more important than Mavuika, even if you're like looking only at optimal pulling. Like she's not anywhere close to the same level as Neuvillette when it comes to carries, even if there are going to be a few teams where she's doing more damage than he does. I also don't expect her to feel good at all in this Abyss because, well, the Cucosaur is kind of a pain in the ass. You'll be able to take care of it with Farina if you play the Farina team, and then you'll be able to take care of this with Xilonen, but the first wave is 3 waves of pyro-resistant enemies. And then on the second side, you gotta deal with the Aeon Blight Drake. And she doesn't actually have a lot of teams that allow her to use bow users. In any case, all in all, I expect her to be a character that is, in terms of just power, one of the best carries. And in terms of pull value, she has a lot of overlap with other good characters. So I don't think she's that high pull value. I think if you already have a well-built Arlecchino, getting Mavuika won't necessarily be a big upgrade for you. And I guess if you're not looking for, like, specifically a new gameplay experience, if all you care about is the power of your account, you will see better results if you already have Arlecchino from pulling an Arlecchino Constellation or Signature versus pulling Mavuika. I really do think, like, the most important thing is to keep in mind that the Leyline disorder for the first Abyss reset after her release is insane for her. So you're gonna see omega inflated numbers, like, in that Abyss. But, yeah, so that's gonna be it for the pre-release. I'm looking forward to Mavuika a lot. I know that people are pretty disappointed with the bike. They think it looks out of place in that one. I understand what they mean, but I don't really care. The bike is the sort of stuff where, like, if I actually think about it, I agree. But I already know that while I'm playing, I'll just be like... And that's gonna be the only thing on my mind. So that's why I'm not too unhappy about it. And in terms of kit design, I do think it's hard to make an appealing Archon without infringing on either Channeling or Bennett's territory. So her kind of doing that for Channeling and almost a little bit on Bennett's territory as well with the damage, but like her doing that is not too surprising. And I do like that she does still feel different because so much of her damage is concentrated in her burst. I'm not too happy about the general trend of power creep that's like starting to solidify itself, but I mean it was gonna happen one day probably no matter what, and it's still not particularly egregious. Looking at all the stuff that we've had since, I guess, Sumeru, outside of Neuvillette, nothing is so powerful that it makes Hyperbloom feel underpowered, because the things that have better output than Hyperbloom tend to have weaknesses in other areas, and I don't think that's something that's become false with Mavuika, but I do think we're starting to be on the edge. I think if she got released in her V1 state, I would have been really disappointed. I was happy to see the nerfs, and I think they're reasonable nerfs. But yeah, overall, I'm relatively happy with her. I'm excited to play with her. So that's gonna be it. As usual, I hope you learned a thing or two. I hope you enjoyed. Keep in mind this is a pre-release, which means everything is still subject to change. If you want to make sure to stay up to date with my thoughts on potential future changes, make sure you subscribe. If there's any major changes before release, I'll probably make a video on that. If there's minor changes, I will be sure to mention them in my first impressions video and in my post-release. So subscribe, keep an eye out for that, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.